Well, hello. Welcome, everyone. I am Michelle Nellenbach, the director of our infrastructure work here at the Bipartisan Policy Center. And thank you all so much for coming on a Monday morning to talk about asset inventories, which I know doesn't seem like the most exciting of topics, but we are so excited about today's panel. There's a lot of really great work being done, both here in DC and across the country. And so we're really looking forward to talking about that. And just a little bit of information about our council. It is the Executive Council on Infrastructure, and its members have largely been focused, have largely been focused on public-private partnerships, how to get more private investment into public infrastructure. And one of the key recommendations they came up with is that there's a misalignment between how municipal governments manage their assets and what private investors look for when they're trying to find projects to invest in. And so the first step should be that all levels of government, including here at the federal level, should do an asset inventory. So cities and states and the federal government should know what they own and what condition it is in. And that will enable them to make better budgeting decisions in terms of putting very limited resources into infrastructure assets. One study that I like to point out is the recent one that New York City had done, where, New York City is fairly large government. Each individual agency may have known, but the city as a whole did not know how many vacant lots it owned. And so the controller of the city ordered an inventory asset, found out they own 1,100 vacant lots across the city. Well, that's valuable real estate that they have now been able to use. One of the primary uses is for public housing. So that's the kind of information that Council has recommended. And importantly, whether you're doing private funding or public funding, we still think you need to do these asset inventories so that we also know where we are putting limited federal resources, that we are in fact putting them towards the most effective projects that will protect the environment, create jobs, and all that good stuff. So today's speakers are going to talk all about asset inventories and all the great work they're doing. I will also point out that this is the inaugural event of BPC's 3I series. It's part of our new infrastructure lab, looking at the council's recommendations and how to implement them and highlighting some innovative work that's going on across the country. So with that, I'm going to turn it over to my colleague, Jake Varn. He is a valuable member of our infrastructure team, and he is going to lead us through the first panel.
Great, thank you, Michelle, and good morning. Welcome, everybody. Thank you all. We're, as Michelle said, we're in the weeds with this one, and there's obviously more exciting news with the government shutdown going on. So I appreciate all of you coming out. Just some housekeeping. You can follow this discussion on our Twitter at BBC_Bipartisan. More importantly, you can follow me at Jake Varn. You can tweet questions at us using the hashtag BPCLive. I have no way to see those questions, but afterwards, I will look at them and think, wow, good questions, everybody. So we have three experts from across the country here talking about asset inventories and infrastructure. To my left, Erin Noel from the city of San Diego, Victoria Olivier from Detroit Future Cities, and Grace Galucci from the Northeastern Ohio Areawide Coordinating Agency. I think I got that acronym right. Perfect. So starting with you, Erin, City of San Diego is undergoing this asset inventory process, this asset management improvement. Can you tell us a little bit about your work and what the City of San Diego has been up to?
Sure, I would love to. I'm very excited, and I will say I do feel like, an infrastructure nerd. I like to start with this slide. So San Diego is a beautiful place, and I went out there about 8 years ago and pretty much fell in love. But when you talk about asset management infrastructure and how to best manage that, this kind of says it all for me, because this is a beautiful place, but the iconic buildings from City Hall to Balboa Park in San Diego, our Mission Beach Wall, the streets, the iconic bridges, all of the infrastructure that's under the ground that you don't see, that is what we need to do to keep the city beautiful and continue to keep it safe. So infrastructure asset management is what the city is working on now. We call it IAM. And we have a couple of things that are going on. One I'll mention briefly, and then the second I'll talk about a little more. We are actually working on an infrastructure plan called the Strategic Asset Management Plan. This is something that is really important as to start off with, so that you have the objectives that you're trying to accomplish with your asset management program, that you have your strategy, and that you have policies that reflect that in place. And it seems like it's something that's very high level. Sometimes we do things backwards in the city, but we are doing this now, and we expect this to be completed in the next couple of months. So we're really excited about that. The second thing, and I'll talk about this just a little more as you ask questions, but we're doing something called IAM San Diego, and this is Infrastructure Asset Management San Diego. It's a project that's developing an end-to-end comprehensive asset management system for managing infrastructure assets pretty much citywide. Our goal is to have all of our infrastructure assets in the system, and it covers not just the maintenance management side of that, but also the future capital planning side, which is a really important part of this. So why are we doing this? Obviously, a lot of us are facing challenges with infrastructure, and this includes a backlog of deferred capital projects. We have competing priorities, and we have limited resources to address that. So it's more important than ever for us to be able to spend those in the right way. We're also investing in technology. The city has over 20 systems, 28 applications that are being replaced with this one system. And some of these are outdated, more than 20 years old. Can you imagine if your phone was 20 years old, what the technology would be like? So we're trying to replace those things, which in some cases were paper-based. In some cases, in all cases, none of these were connected to each other, but they also weren't connected to the city's financial system. So this is really important for us to help enable state-of-the-art technology to support our staff. And this includes mobile capabilities to be used by our crews out in the field. So we're really excited about that. And just to wrap up, the 4 key capabilities, you can imagine 28 applications being replaced. There's a lot of functionality that this will have. But the keys are maintenance management systems. It's map-based. It's connected to our current SAP system. So this is an SAP-based system. It also includes the mobile capabilities, as I mentioned. Again, map-based, so you can actually create work out in the field from a map. We also have something called asset management planning. This is something that is helping us to plan over long-term for our capital needs, so that we can actually bundle projects that are co-located together and avoid that digging up the street again and again and again for different projects. And of course, great analytics and reporting are part of the system.
Great. Okay. Thanks, Erin. Victoria, you're coming at this from a slightly different angle with Detroit Future Cities. As a nonprofit, you work with the city. You've helped set a comprehensive strategic vision. Can you tell us a little bit about the angle you're coming from for this asset inventory, asset management approach?
Absolutely. So when you first asked me on the panel, I did kind of push a little, and I was like, are you sure? But recognizing that Detroit is very different from Washington, D.C., I'll just kind of take a minute to set the stage of when this plan was put together. So 2010, City of Detroit sort of edging towards bankruptcy. It's under Mayor Bing's administration. The city had lost 25% of its population between 2000 and 2010. City government was really just kind of low capacity, did not have the trust of residents to be thinking strategically, was really in crisis mode. But at the same time, still investment, and those who cared about the city were just seeking a way to make sure that their dollars went further, that people were coordinated, but the blueprint just really didn't exist. Prior plans were looking purely from economic development or a land use perspective, and we needed something that actually talked about the reality of the city, that talked about an overbuilt infrastructure for a city of 2 million where you had maybe 700,000 on a good day. And that was overbuilt, under-resourced, that also looked at a comprehensive vacant land strategy. And so the strategic framework led by Detroit Future City, which was an effort, there's 24 months in the millions of dollars, and really married technical expertise from across the globe to the community expertise in neighborhoods through a robust engagement process, which has probably never been seen before in this type of planning effort. And so I have a slide that just is kind of like the double helix of the 350-page plan, so you can kind of get the gist of it, but looking at economic growth, and so a very asset-based approach, knowing that we did have industrial buildings, that we had infrastructure and corridors that really could be leveraged for future growth. It might look different and a different type of economy, but then also you needed to connect your residents to those centers of economic growth. And we had a transit system that was, you just kind of run ghost buses. You wouldn't see anybody on there. But reality that at 40% poverty rate, you still needed to have a transit system. But maybe it didn't need to be a full bus. It could maybe be a van. It could be on demand. How do you think critically about realigning that transportation? And then looking at a city where your green, your vacant land could be turned into green landscapes and have benefits, health benefits, economic benefits, beautification. Then looking at the neighborhoods you had that were still thriving and thinking differently about neighborhoods in the future. Detroit is known for having single-family homes kind of blanketing the city, but it was really not where the market was. And then how does this kind of lay on top of each other to look at a 50-year land use map? So put it all together, and this is the classic plan that you don't want on the shelf. And so how are we actually going to activate this? So it's kind of a loose collective impact model. With this slide, it has the implementation team at the Detroit Future City office kind of leading it, but that could be swapped out for city government. But the idea is that whoever you are and however big you are, you're never big enough to achieve it all. And how can you go further faster with partnerships? And so this was looking at the faith-based community, nonprofits that have been carrying the water, while the government, was very weak. Residents, building a civic infrastructure, but also thinking about how, private sector and public sector really needed to work together. And so as an implementation office, we do research, advocacy, we convene partners, we lead some implementation efforts on our own to help advance this document. And so finally, my baby is kind of the vacant land network. So you just heard New York City uncovered like 1,100 vacant parcels. So, through our inventory work, that's 120,000 vacant parcels of land, 72,000, a little over, are publicly owned. And that's growing every day. Detroit has the most robust demolition program in the country. And so we know that this is going to continue to grow as we eradicate blight.
Great, thanks, Victoria. So, also with a different perspective, Grace, you're with a regional, the Northeast Ohio area Areawide coordinating agency. I put myself under the gun to try to say the whole thing again.
We just call ourselves NOACA.
NOACA, perfect. You are a regional group. You have 5 counties under your scope. You're a municipal planning organization. Can you walk us through the differences of what that means for you and the different types of assets that are under your jurisdiction?
So first, I want to thank you very much for having NOACA be here today. And then I want to congratulate you on having a panel on transportation asset management with only women on the panel. That's a rarity, so thank you for working towards that diversity. Did not go unnoticed.
Michelle, you can just switch for me. I'll just jump off.
So who are we and how did we get here? We're a metropolitan planning organization. So we are the agency that is responsible for transportation and environmental planning for Northeast Ohio. Northeast Ohio includes the metropolitan statistical area around Cleveland. So we are Cleveland plus the county of Cuyahoga, which is Cleveland's home, and then the 4 counties surrounding, Lake, Lorain, Medina, and Geauga. What makes our geography unique, and particularly related to transportation asset management, is that we are a combination of both rural and urban areas. And so that's who we are. We have a board of 45 members. They are assigned to the board based on population, and they are elected officials. So it is a very collaborative board, but the board's job is very difficult in that they have to deal both with their own unique circumstances and then the regional circumstances. So when I first arrived at NOACA 5 years ago, it was very obvious that wear and tear on the road structure had gone beyond what was being accepted in the community. And we, as an agency, thought, how are we going to address this? And it was beyond this. If you look to that slide over there, and that's really what began our process. And that has nothing to do with transportation asset management. It is more about culture change, and it's more about a top-down approach where our board said, look, we have got to work as a region. We have to advance the goals of the agency. Let's clarify what that is. And they talk about strengthening regional cohesion, preserving existing infrastructure, and creating or building a multimodal sustainable transportation system. We're going to focus on preserving existing infrastructure and what does that mean, and why it was important for us to come up with, the T is for transportation, but it could just as easily be transformative, or a transformative transportation asset management program. You have to understand the history. The history is the Cleveland area has had a population gain of 0. Hasn't lost any, but it hasn't gained anything. But it increased in its developed footprint by 33%. So you're talking about sprawl, and you're talking about the same number of people now being responsible to maintain an increasing number of roads, road miles, and all of the other transportation assets that go with it. And recognizing that, of course, the gas tax hadn't increased at the federal level since 1993. At the state level, I believe it was 2006. And so how do we better allocate the resources we have into a way that is really acceptable to all? And so we began exactly what many of the others did, an inventory. What do we have? 5 counties. I'm sure the county engineers know what are county roads. I'm sure that the DOT knew what the state routes are. The municipal level, they understand and know how to maintain their individual roadways. But collectively, there wasn't really a process that looked at it holistically. The approach was this. Everyone submitted an application when they thought they needed a road rehabilitated or a road widened or whatever they needed. They put an application in. There were some very flat standards that said if your road is below a condition of, let's say, 55, I think it was 55. We use the PCI index that was developed by the Army Corps of Engineers, 0 to 100, 100 being best, 0 being worst. 55 in the urban areas and 65 in the rural areas are typically what ODOT accepts in the state. So we use those as your baseline. And so people would submit applications, and as long as they met the baseline, you took it. However, we also then said, well, the baseline for different counties are different. So we ended up saying no to anybody, and you just got in line. So every application was funded. It was funded over time, and it didn't necessarily mean that this priority was higher than that priority, or this was even a priority at all. And there wasn't really an assessment of condition other than standard, but there was no assessment of any of the other aspects of how you would develop a plan. So essentially, we were viewed more as a bank or an resource allocation agency than a planning agency. We wanted to change that paradigm. We wanted to ensure that we were planning for the best regional system, and that the communities that we served would agree with us that the plans we developed jointly were the right way to go, as opposed to an application and get in line process. So that's how we started. we built up the inventory, we developed criteria, we developed everything from vehicle miles traveled to regional asset base, a number of different kinds of meaningful inputs, and put that on a transportation technology-based tool that we call Road Matrix, which actually is a Stantec tool, but we modified some of the decision trees for ourselves. And at this point, and I'm sure we'll talk more about it as we get into the questions, we think that we have succeeded in increasing the amount of roads that have been maintained, and the overall priorities of those roads are certainly being noticed.
Great. Thanks, Grace. Both Victoria and Grace, you guys touched on some of the unique challenges that your cities face, financially or population-wise, that changes over time. For San Diego, Erin, what are some of the unique things about San Diego? What do you guys? I know there's water conservation issues. What are some of the unique aspects for those who might not be familiar with the city's landscape?
Yeah, so we definitely have challenges. The city is responsible for both water and sewer utilities, and we have challenges in terms of very strict requirements for water cleanliness that we're required to be in compliance with, and so as well as the drought. The city's been reliant on imported water, so I believe it's about 95% of the water has to be imported. Very costly. The city currently has a really big project going on now called Pure Water, and that is something where it's potable reuse. So we're really excited about that. But all of these different factors, have to be taken into account as we're trying to prioritize where we're putting our dollars and investing. So those are some of the key things that come to mind.
Just top line, you've all mentioned some of the benefits you hope to see, but just what are some of the tangible, direct impacts that this inventory and these asset management processes have really made on your day-to-day life, or in the grand scheme of things? Has it helped create efficiencies with government? Has it helped you, lobby for funding in a better capacity? Let's start with our nonprofit, who has the least ability to directly impact change.
Well, I would say that the strategic framework has been accomplishing its goals, which is, it's sparking conversations, it's catalyzing action, it's bringing together unlikely partners, and some really tangible projects that have come out of this. And of course, you won't see the city of Detroit quoting the Detroit Future City Strategic Framework saying, we've accomplished this. They want to take that ownership of it, and that's great. We want to see a strong, successful government. But they've very much internalized that work. So you could take something, this was a huge hot button issue. You've probably all heard about how Detroit had 88,000 street lights, but only half were working. They'd been stripped. The city was dark. Quality of life was in shambles. So that was an issue that had to be taken care of immediately, really to help people even think long-term about infrastructure. It was such an immediate need. But there was really no guidance around how that would be done. Would it just be, going back to the same poles and the same lights? And the strategic framework was looking at replacing across the board LED lights, thinking about where, do you need 88,000 when you have a population that has diminished, and maybe you have solar lights where you are in high vacancy areas. And so the city of Detroit kind of spun off a public lighting authority to get funding in line for this, and they were able to install 66,000 LED lights. And so now we are the largest city in America with a full LED light system. And that's really changed how people feel about their neighborhoods, feel about government. To get back to the map where I showed the vacant land portfolio, I mean, if you can think about Detroit Future City on a lot of different levels around city systems and asset management, kind of at a higher level, and starting to demonstrate the need to really understand and more fine-grain how we wrap our arms around these enormous problems. So we could plot all of the vacant land, but then it was taken a step further through a project called Motor City Mapping, where 378,000 parcels were mapped, photos taken, condition of houses or lots were inventoried, It was residents going out and doing this work over 6 months in the winter. And now we have a database where you can look at any parcel and know who owns it. Is this a candidate for demolition? Do we need to go out and board that? So it helped the Land Bank Authority understand their inventory and how they can start to apply strategies to actually manage it and not just be kind of a purveyor of blight in the city. So I would say you see the strategies and actions from the strategic framework all over the government initiatives, and we're very proud of that.
That street lighting process, at least part of that was done as a public-private partnership, is that right?
Yes. And so you've seen the cost for the city go down by half. I mean, that I can't impress that enough, that the financial stability of the city is still, even though we're out of bankruptcy, you're not like out of out of the woods. And so coming up with these partnerships and new ways of doing things is so pivotal to advancing the initiatives in the city.
Great, thanks. Grace, you touched a little bit on aligning some of the regional entities and breaking down silos. Can you talk a little bit more of that with some of the day-to-day benefits that this process has had?
Absolutely. There's no doubt that this process really helped to meet one of the board's objective, being regional cohesion, collaboration. We collaborated with the Ohio Department of Transportation initially to get a grant for $600,000 from FHWA, the Federal Highway System, and collaborated then with the county engineers as well as city engineers to put together a blue ribbon panel that essentially guided this process, which of course then certainly helped later on to ensure that they were buying into it and that they effectively would work with us to use it. In terms of ongoing efforts, what's really neat about it is there's a whole lot less negotiating. There's a little negotiating, but the first year that I was there and we had to talk to the city about what projects we thought they should do. And at that time, we didn't have this process in place, but we had some priorities that I was trying to get staff to put together manually. And so we went for a meeting and we said, well, here's the list of projects that we think should be done based on the kinds of things that we think are important regionally for us. And they looked at that and they said, okay, well, here's our list. And it was a totally different list. And it's like, well, wait a minute. Why is this list important to you? And how did you come up with this list? And like most of the communities that do this, they took a look at a number of things that were important to them, including how their own funding strategies worked, and came up with a list. Once they better understood how we wanted to work this, then it became a matter of right now, we produce a list. Our system is able to develop a prioritized system, which you never want to use by itself. It is intended to be a tool for discussion, not this is the ranking, because certainly depending on the data you put in, you're going to get different data coming out. But it is a base of discussion, and we would say, okay, with this sensitivity analysis, we get this. If we've got this much money, we could do that. Here's what we'd like to do. And now the communities or the cities, counties we're working with will look at it and say, okay, and I'd say we probably agree on 90% of what comes out of our system. And that's because they were part of the team that put things together as what should be the inputs. And the remaining amount, say 10% of the road network, they may say, well, we think this is really important, but you don't have that, and here's why. And we might say, well, maybe we missed something, and they'll tell us something. For example, one road that was not on our list, actually there were two roads, North and South Marginal Road. They are the roads that go right in front of our small downtown airport, and it's not that often used. Usually it's corporate jets and it's presidents and ex-presidents, and it really came to light when George W. Bush came to make a presentation or a speech. They picked him up at the airport, took him to a hotel that's probably no farther than a few blocks away. He stood up during his presentation and said, "Mayor, fix your roads." He drove on North and South Marginal roads. Now, when the president tells you that, there's something you really ought to look at, and it became obvious it didn't show up on our list because it didn't have high enough vehicle miles traveled, and it didn't have some of the other characteristics. But when we looked at it, The vehicle miles traveled in some ways weren't there because the road was so horrible, people avoided it. So they only took it if they had to in and out of the airport. When we started looking at it, it was a major connector, or they're major connectors to I-90. And this was all being missed. So we agreed, yeah, that should be done. And it's fantastic now. So that was an example. In some cases, they didn't understand why we had a priority, but we were saying, well, we would like you to consider this because it goes through 2 other counties. And so we want to do it all together. So I think the collaboration and cohesion part, definitely. I do want to emphasize your point of efficiency, and you kind of heard some of that now, but you have to understand, with limited resources and everybody needing and wanting projects, or road rehabilitations, or bringing your infrastructure into a state of good repair, how do you decide on the best ones? This has really provoked an interest and an enthusiasm for the use of data-driven tools. People are no longer saying, well, this is really important for my community because of, XYZ businesses are located there, or maybe this school is located there, or maybe this hospital, or maybe because. There's a number of other things that go into that, and we look at it totally regionally. So efficiency is without a doubt at the top of the list, and more so than just the selection of the roads, the financing of them behind the scenes. So our staff is better able to project what's going to be spent over the next 4 years in what we call the TIP, the Transportation Improvement Plan. We're also better able to look at the long-range needs, and better able to actually finance. Go to the state. We borrow money from other MPOs who don't have this system in place yet, so we think are not as efficient as we are yet, and then we pay them back when they're ready to do their project. We have been able to advance tens of millions of dollars in this way. And then lastly, but not least important at all, is equity. We really have been able to drive forward the notion that a state of good repair, meaning your roads are needed to be in a system of good repair, isn't just for communities that have money or communities that are of a certain color. So income and race should not have anything to do with the network conditions, but it did. And it did mostly because the majority of roadway network in our region is going to be in the urban areas. It's where most of the businesses are. It's where people come into work, so they're the most heavily used. And the city, in large part, can't manage all of those together without the assistance of the Metropolitan Planning Organization. We view them as regional assets, not just city assets, or not just state or county assets within the city. We're looking at what is it for a region. And so we developed standards and targets that said every community needs to be at X in terms of the 0 to 100. And we don't care if you're the richest county, who typically maintains theirs at 75, or the poorest county, which typically actually did have roads that were about 45. And what we found was the ones that were 75, as soon as they got to 74, they were in that queue. They were getting their money, and that it wasn't really working out to be regionally equitable. It is more regionally equitable because it's data-driven. It's looking at what needs to be done to gain the most benefit for the most people and for the region.
Thank you for that. I do want to plug the BPC's evidence-based policymaking project that we have here. Rings true on a lot of levels. Erin, I'm sure some of that sounds familiar. For the city of San Diego, this has been a multi-year effort for you. You mentioned some of the deferred maintenance that you were able to catalog. Can you talk a little bit more about that and some of the other benefits that have come out of your work?
Sure. We actually have been doing asset management in the city, but it's been very stovepiped, and a lot of different departments have been doing it based on their different asset types and doing it in their own way. We've been doing condition assessments. Depending on the department, there are the haves and the have-nots, right? So if you have fee-based or rate-based, and you have an enterprise fund, you definitely have more capital there to invest in the systems to support, whereas our Park and Rec department is general fund, and so they're competing with basically our police and fire, right? So very hard to get a new roof on the rec center there, or our libraries. So there have been a lot of challenges, and I believe, the system, again, it's a tool, but it really does help you to have a sound basis for what you're doing. And then the human element is added into that. It's really building a way for us to develop a multi-year capital plan. We currently have a 5-year plan in the city. It's so hard to do that without having a tool, a system to develop it. And a lot of the staff are very excited because they know this process will be easier to do, will help to take the politics out of it, will also help us to have a more long-term plan. We have 5 years, really 10 or 20 years when you're talking about infrastructure, makes more sense. And then that does support the budgets. Like I said, when we're competing with police and fire, being able to look out over 10 years and go for grants and make plans. I know there are a lot of cities in California, and San Francisco is a good example where they've done general obligation bond programs, and they've been very successful with voters because they can tell them specifically what projects are going to get done with that money, so people are more willing to pay for it. So that's kind of the next step for us. I think we've come a long way on the journey, and the education part of it to the public. The first responses from the city council members when we came with this was, why don't we already do that? Why aren't we already doing this? And it's hard to explain why it's so important and how much information is needed, and why an investment in a system, which everybody doesn't want to invest in a system, right? But why the outcome of that is to make us more efficient, to make us smarter, to help us to put our investments in the right place. So in the long term, we're really using our money wisely.
On the flip side of that, and I'm going to come right back to you, Erin, I'm sure there's cities and regions around the country that are hearing your guys' presentations and thinking, why aren't we doing that right now? How do we get started? Can you walk them through some of the lessons learned, some of the challenges you ran into when you first got started this process, and as it developed? Were there certain assets that were harder to calculate the deferred maintenance for? Was there certain juggling acts you had to compete with, or?
Yeah, there have been a lot of lessons learned through the process. And I actually started working on this when I first came to San Diego. I was in the office of the city auditor. So we were doing performance audits similar to GAO, but I looked at the capital improvements program. And by looking at it end to end, how are we figuring out what we're doing? What are best practices? And that's asset management. And what are the steps to getting there? Having something like that as a catalyst to say, here are the recommendations, and then the city comes back to that. It's been a long haul process, and transformative, but it does take a lot of being able to message effectively. I feel like when I wrote that report, I was saying all the things that I'm saying now, but I'm not saying them in the same way. So you have to be able to reach your message to people in a way that really hits home to them, and saying it over and over and over again. And making sure you're getting in front of the right people to get the support. We had to work getting the support from the mayor's office, from the city council, the executive team, throughout all the departments, because to them, they might feel like we're taking away some of their power, if you will, or their right to make a decision, but that's not really true. It's really bringing us all together to be able to do it in the most efficient way from a citywide perspective.
Thanks. Victoria, you touched on this earlier. You started in 2010 for the city of Detroit during extreme financial duress. So I'm sure there are a lot of challenges just on that front getting started. But what also have you seen for the city and for Detroit's future cities work? Lessons learned for other municipal and regional?
Yeah. So of course we share, given the circumstances of Detroit and every city, limited resources. But the need just being so great, coming from decades and decades of deferred maintenance, disinvestment. So you can understand why that would take a large toll on residents. And so when you're doing these planning processes or asset inventories, it doesn't come with any degree of surprise that they would be contentious. They could be divisive. Thinking about their areas of growth and then their areas of the word we used was transformation, kind of a softer word, but the idea that that's where the majority of the vacant land was. And so I think despite the financial investment, the time investment to really be innovative about how we engaged residents through this process, there were still issues once those lines are finally drawn on a map or a strategy is released to the public. And so I would, while we definitely preach data-driven approaches, also how you complement that and continue to complement that after your planning process might be complete through education, engagement with residents. One of the most contentious maps was the one around city systems. So looking at if you are renewing in that area, if you are just investing, or if you're just maintaining, or if you're thinking about even decommissioning. If it's an area where it's going to be long-term green space, you don't need the same infrastructure. And the reality is people were still living in those areas. So as you're thinking about adjustments in land use, it was very important to say and kind of preach that truth that having an overbuilt system for a more limited population was kind of bringing down everybody's services, and the burden that everyone was carrying, especially for a city that has a high poverty rate, it just wasn't sustainable for the city or for residents, and so changes needed to happen. So a lot of lessons that we learned were just about, and work that we do is continuing to engage. And also as we work with the government, reminding people that those partnerships, and when you do need to prioritize. I mean, DFC was really built on the idea that you can't spread the peanut butter and expect that things are going to change. But that, residents and community groups are prioritizing. And so how do you engage them in this work where they've probably done some of that work for you, and you can create champions for change?
So we just have a few minutes left for the panel, and we're going to open it up for audience Q&A in a few moments. So just start thinking about what you might want to ask our experts. I'll close out with you, Grace, in a two-parter. So what are some of the lessons learned as well for MPOs around the country that they deal with the same siloed and regional issues that you've been tackling? And then also, what do you see your work looking like in 5 years? Where do you see this heading towards? You've talked a little bit about some of the benefits, but looking into the future, what do you see really being some of the catalysts that'll come out of this?
So we are the first MPO in the country to have developed a transportation asset management program and implemented. And that is one of the reasons we worked real closely with FHWA, and they funded us. So we're happy to share what we've done, and in any kind of environment. So I would tell them that if they would like to begin that program, we'd be happy to work with them. When we think about opportunities or challenges during that process, as I said at the beginning, it has to be top down. I was very fortunate as staff that I had a board that knew change had to happen in our region. And they wanted to work together to really look at things more regionally. And so gave me the latitude to come up with different ways that they could accomplish that. But they put a lot of hard work into developing a regional strategic plan, a new emphasis on a long-range plan, and so kind of noting that TAMP was not something we did in and of itself. It was really part of the larger scenario, and if you try to do it just as a program for the improvement of the road network's infrastructure, trying to get a higher score on the infrastructure numbers, it's not going to be as effective. It really was about a culture change and about thinking how the region would move forward. So again, thinking about it that way. Involving all the others in collaboration. One of the things that we always feel that helps, where you initially might have challenges because people don't like change, and those communities maybe that were doing better by making their own decisions are not necessarily going to want someone to interfere with that decision making. but allowing that to be a collaboration. And then we're developing, and we're about to lay this out now, that same process is now going to be available on the web for each community as well. So all of the inventory information goes in there. We're doing it at the regional level. They could use it at the local level. And so that will also help us to have that dialogue. In terms of long range, I think one of the biggest sort of outcomes that we are looking for is that equity. We want a system that is in a state of good repair as best as it can be, but we want that equitably. We want it to be data-driven and really ensuring that the system that has the most attention is the system that has the most benefits to the community. So I think that's what we're trying to aim for long term, and I'm hoping that we're going to get there. We've set some pretty high targets, and we want every community to be at that level.
Thanks. Last 30 seconds for each of you. Hopes and dreams for the next 5 and 10 years for this project? Let's start with you, Erin.
I'm really excited because we've got 5 departments that are in our system that will be in March 12th. But we want to put all of our different departments in there. And so that's kind of the next step is to get the rest of the assets into the system for us to be good at using the system. So as city staff to really master that and see how we want to use it. And then for us to help find a way to finance what we need to finance as we go forward.
Victoria?
So for us, it is an open space plan. We've spent the past 5 years advocating for this, taking the framework to kind of the next level, much more fine grain, doing all of the research. So every time the city says, oh, no, we can't deal with this vacant land inventory, we're like, oh, but we figured out how, or here are the experts that could help you. So they've finally committed to doing this work, and so we're really hoping that once we have taking the inventory that I outlined and actually looking at what are the uses, where do they make sense, giving transparency to both residents who want to purchase land, to investors that want to look at productive uses of land. It could be looking at how we are a food sovereign city. It could be renewable energy. There's a host of things that we can do once we actually have a disposition process and we understand how we can make these linkages to really improve quality of life in the city. So that's the direction that we're headed. And we also have kind of a mandate now through our consent decree for stormwater management. So they're revising the stormwater fee, and we're doing a post-construction ordinance, which is really going to go a long way as we think about kind of land as new infrastructure and kind of building that microgrid to help keep our stormwater out of our system, which again results in combined sewer overflows into the Great Lakes, world's fresh water supply, so you can thank us later. But I think there's a lot of progress that's going to happen in the next 5 years with that.
Great. So we have a few minutes for some audience questions. If you could just announce where you're from, where you're coming from. We have mics running around, so if you just wait a minute for them to get to you. Go ahead.
Thank you. Luke Lorenz, the Nonpartisan Policy Alliance. My question is for Ms. Scalucci. You mentioned that your organization acts in some ways kind of like a regional infrastructure bank for these 5 counties. Mm-hmm. I'm curious if you think that we might be able to get the same kinds of efficiencies and benefits from a similar institution at the state level. In other words, a regional infrastructure bank for the Northeast United States or the Southwest. It sounds like having this coordination is very beneficial.
Absolutely, and I can't emphasize enough how our partnership with the Ohio Department of Transportation has allowed some of our borrowing strategies to work. So they do have a state infrastructure bank that we borrow from, and then that allows us to do a whole number of additional projects, as well as they have given us as MPOs in the state the authority to work with each other to have borrowing strategies. And so that's something that's pretty unique, and we're grateful for that. Could there be something at the federal level that did sort of the mega regions? Yeah, I think that would be terrific. One of the challenges that you'll have in developing this system is once you are now able to put forward a very comprehensive plan that identifies the projects that need to be done when and the methodology you must use to get to a state of good repair, and now you've got the cost, $1 billion, now you're expected to make that happen. And when you only get funding of probably a fraction of that billion, how do you make that happen? And it is it is the creative financing strategies that come into play here.
Victoria, Erin, does that ring true for you guys as working at the city level, that you could benefit from a more regional entity or regional approach working with your surrounding counties and cities?
Yes, there's no question that there's definitely value in working together. San Diego is very populous, so it's the 8th most populous. I think we're still 7 or 8, we go back and forth, but really spread out and interconnected with some other smaller cities as well as the San Diego County. So there's definitely efficiencies to be gained from that.
Yeah, I mean, absolutely. Detroit has kind of been the black sheep of the region, and we're just kind of coming around, I think, with some of these initiatives and, stronger, competent government. Our biggest challenge, even coming from a transportation perspective, we had a millage that went up. We don't have a regional transit authority that works with the city of Detroit. So the millage didn't pass. And then, here comes Amazon and they want a regional transit system. And our feedback from not making it to the top 20 was, hey, you didn't have a regional transit system, which we all knew. And so, looking at the next time the millage comes up, we're really grateful that that's been back in the conversation. And we're thinking even ahead of that, of how we connect with the suburbs, even through non-motorized transit. We're in the works for a 26-mile connected greenway through the city, and so some of that is off-road, like rails to trails. Some of that is leveraging existing bicycle network, and some of that is doing road diets. We no longer need 8, 10-lane roads, and then adding to our bike lanes. But then thinking about the connections to both regional transit. There's actually a bicycle trail that goes throughout the state of Michigan, even up to the Upper Peninsula, that this will connect to. We have a new international bridge crossing to Canada that is being developed, and you'll be able to ride your bike to Canada. So kind of think about all of these connections. And so I'm really proud of the city thinking ahead about even if we're not connected as a region, let's leave those options open because it's the direction that we're headed. And so as much kind of policy that could be set and planning that we really need to do at the regional level is the next frontier. Yeah. DFC kind of or the Detroit Future City Strategic Framework kind of needed to look inward and get our house in order before we were really able to think kind of regional planning perspective. So we're, I think, at that next frontier.
The Detroit and Michigan Future Cities.
Oh, yes.
We'll get some new branding for you. Time for a few more questions. Up front.
I'm Bob Hershey. I'm a consultant here in Washington. To what extent have you been able to use the internet to have meetings and get funding together for projects?
Yeah. So this is a digital enterprise, the Inventories. You mentioned that San Diego started 20 years ago, and the 20 years ago when this project started, you had paper-based. You were still working with 20-year-old systems. Can you talk a little bit about the actual programs you're using, some of the innovations technologically?
Yeah, so we had a lot of different systems in place 20 years ago. Clearly, a lot of those are obsolete now. They were paper-based. So if you can imagine, say a pothole crew comes into the yard for the day, right? And they would come in and print out what they had work to do. They would have a clipboard and they would have a radio. Now we have cell phones, but not always Wi-Fi in some areas. But they would go out, they would do their work, they would take notes, they go back and they type in to the system the work that they've done, the notes that they've taken. Now we actually have mobile devices. So we have Toughbook laptops as well as just tablets where they go into the yard, upload all of the work they have for the day. They can put their crews and they can put the vehicles they're going to be using, and that connects to our HR system, so their time is going to be preloaded into the system as they work on different work orders for the day. They just type in what they're doing as they go. If they're offline, it actually syncs up automatically so that it's downloaded into the mothership, if you will. And that also allows them to report if they're out in the field and they see, say a light is out, obviously they're not the right crew for that. They could report that directly from the map. And that would go into the queue of the correct crew, even if it's a different department. So this is, enabling them. They come back at the end of the day. They don't need that time to type everything in, to do their timesheet separately. So really a large advance, we feel, to support our crews.
Yeah, and I know that a similar initiative has been underway for DC Water, having iPads out in the field so they can see where a broken pipe is, see exactly the location, see when the last maintenance crew was there. Any other thoughts on advancements in technology, Grace?
Yeah, in developing the regional strategic plan, and I think one of the other panelists mentioned this, the public outreach and the communications is clearly a major driving force. So although it started from the board downward, we really engaged folks. And a lot of ways that we did that was using workshops and a lot of internet-based tools, such as helping folks to learn what asset management is, getting their feedback on why it's important. We had a game that we put online that allowed people to have coins, so they had a budget and they could buy things with their budget, and it sort of helped them to understand the decisions that we had to make and then why they were making them. So we just did a lot of creative things. We partnered with our PBS station to do some internet work as well. So there was a lot there. And as I mentioned, we now are going from a server-based system to a cloud-based system to allow other entities to join in the use of that for their own purposes.
Any thoughts, Victoria?
I want to jump on the game idea. I actually just played a really fun game called Game of Floods. It was by the American Society of Adaptation Professionals. And so they put this together primarily for city government, but I think it works for residents, kind of pulling out, the participatory budgeting, some elements from that, but really putting it in climate scenarios. And you have the asset inventory from your hypothetical city, and you have to make those hard decisions about how you're going to deal with that next 100-year flood. So this is something that's already kind of pre-packaged that you can pull from, I believe, their website. But to get back to some kind of internet advances that we've made, we do have an app, and I know this is in probably multiple cities, but just where residents can self-report issues with infrastructure. And of course, it's only as successful as the responsiveness from your government, but our mayor is adamant that no request is unfulfilled for more than 24 hours, and that you're getting, if it's going to be longer than 24 hours, you're receiving status updates every 8 hours. And so I personally submitted some anywhere from illegal dumping to a water main break to an increasingly large pothole, and seen incredible response rates, which I think is really building up the trust in our local government. And one thing that I didn't mention about the LED streetlights is, in addition to being twice as bright and more energy efficient, that they also have the ability to transmit Wi-Fi, that they also have connected vehicle technology capabilities, and I don't think these have been activated yet, but and they're still trying to figure out how do we use these further, but I was very impressed that they kind of were thinking that way.
Yeah, and I'm sure that'll be really helpful with the autonomous vehicle push that's happening in Detroit.
Oh, absolutely.
Yeah. Well, from autonomous vehicles to a SimCity app, covering a lot of ground here. Another question right up front. This is probably our last question.
Yes, good morning.
You just wait for the mic so the webcast can pick you up.
I'm Manny Vega. I'm an independent consultant on infrastructure and P3. My question is for Ms. Noel and Olivier, and it has to do with asset management or asset inventory is a good initial step. So beyond that, how do you engage, your organization engages with the city to plan what assets to either maintain, renew, dispose, or develop?
Yeah, so back to the prioritization idea.
Yeah, so really inventory is the building block, a first step to have. In some of our departments, as I mentioned, they had systems previously, so that just was basically downloaded into our system. But there's a varying degree of correct data. There's a lot of missing data. It's very difficult for us to do quality control on that. Definitely one of the most valuable lessons learned is you will have data issues. That's the number one. But as you start to build upon that, and as I mentioned before, we have been doing condition assessments. Again, we were able to bring all of that information into the system. So it's more than an inventory. It's something that enables you to look across various factors to help to prioritize what. So condition information is super important, and then the next step then is to enable you to prioritize based on all of that information that you have in the system and the tools that you have.
All right, any last thoughts for any quick questions from the audience? If not, please join me. Oh, Grace, go ahead.
Wanted to also emphasize, I spoke a lot about roads, and just to not ignore public transit, we are currently working on the same process for our public transit system. So we're putting together an asset inventory, a condition assessment, and then developing the same tool set to get at how do we prioritize region-wide on what those are. And to point to our vision statement, why do we do all this? It's not just about TAMP. It's not about, why do we do it to support economic development and the quality of life in our region? So always keeping that in perspective.
Yeah, the diversity of infrastructure assets is something that we frequently talk about here at the BPC. You know, some of you are focused on roads, but it is broader than roads. It's everything that city government owns. So please join me in thanking our panelists. We'll now go back to Michelle.